April 15th, 1912, 2:20 in the morning, the North Atlantic Ocean. Water temperature 28 degrees Fahrenheit. The RMS Titanic, the largest moving object ever constructed by human hands, breaks apart and disappears beneath the surface in under 3 hours. Of the 2,224 people aboard, 1,502 do not survive. It is the deadliest peacetime maritime disaster in history. Among the dead are 3 of the wealthiest men in the world. John Jacob Astor IV, net worth approximately $87 million in 1912 money, roughly $3 billion today. The richest passenger aboard the ship and one of the richest men on earth. Benjamin Guggenheim, mining magnate, heir to one of the largest industrial fortunes in America. As the water rose around him, he reportedly changed into his finest evening wear and told a steward, "We've dressed in our best and are prepared to go down like gentlemen." Isidor Straus, co-owner of Macy's, the largest department store in the world, his wife Ida refused to leave his side. She was offered a seat in a lifeboat. She refused it. They were last seen sitting together in deck chairs as the ocean swallowed the ship around them. 3 titans of American wealth, dead in the same water on the same night. And the man who built the ship, who owned the company that operated it, who had a private suite reserved on the maiden voyage with his name on the door, canceled his trip at the last moment. His name was J.P. Morgan. And what happened in the 20 months after that ship sank would reshape every dollar ever printed, every bank ever opened, every loan ever made in the United States from that moment to this one. This is not just the story of the Titanic. This is the story of a financial system designed by 6 men in secret on a private island under false names that has controlled the American money supply for over a century. And whether the iceberg was an accident or not may matter far less than what those 6 men decided before the ship ever left the dock. Here are the documented facts in sequence. In December 1913, 20 months after the Titanic sank, the United States Congress passed the Federal Reserve Act, creating the most powerful central banking system in human history. A system that a small group of men had been attempting to establish for years, a system that faced fierce opposition from Americans who understood exactly what a central bank would mean for the independence of private wealth from the banking establishment. 3 of the men most associated with opposition to concentrated financial power died on a ship owned by the man most associated with pushing that power forward. The man who owned the ship was not on it. These are the facts. The interpretation is what has divided people for over 100 years. The claim, believed by millions and discussed since before most of us were born, connects those facts into something more deliberate. J.P. Morgan, through his International Mercantile Marine Company, controlled the White Star Line. White Star Line owned and operated the Titanic. Morgan and his banking associates had spent years trying to establish a central bank in the United States, the last major economy on Earth without one. European banking dynasties had already succeeded in England, France, Germany, and Austria. The American market was the final prize. Astor, Guggenheim, and Straus were among the wealthiest men in the country outside the Morgan banking axis. Men whose fortunes gave them the independence to resist what a central bank would mean for the financial autonomy of self-made industrial wealth. The claim holds that these men opposed the concentration of monetary power in the hands of a private banking cartel, that they had the resources and the influence to fight it, and that they did not survive the voyage. Morgan himself canceled his trip, citing health concerns. He was reportedly seen in France shortly afterward in noticeably fine condition at a resort in company. He would be dead within a year regardless, but he was alive on April 15th, 1912. The ship his company built and operated carried lifeboats sufficient for barely 1/3 of the passengers aboard. White Star Line had the option to exceed the minimum safety requirements set by outdated Board of Trade regulations. They chose not to. The most extreme version of the claim holds that the Titanic was never the Titanic at all, that it was actually the Olympic, a sister ship that had been damaged in a prior collision, swapped into service in an elaborate insurance fraud scheme. That version requires the most coordination and has the least supporting documentation. But the core version, that Morgan knew the ship was inadequately equipped, ensured that specific men were aboard, made certain that he was not, and allowed the mathematics of the North Atlantic to do the rest, that version has circulated in serious historical circles for decades. The Federal Reserve Act passed in December 1913. The men who drafted it in secret had been planning it since at least 1910, and 3 of the wealthiest potential opponents were already dead. Now here is where this story goes somewhere you may not expect. The evidence that Astor, Guggenheim, and Straus were specifically targeted because of their positions on central banking is, by any honest measure, thin. Their documented opinions on monetary policy are sparse. Astor was primarily a real estate investor. Straus ran a department store. Guggenheim was in mining. They were powerful men, but the paper trail connecting them to vocal opposition against the Federal Reserve specifically is not substantial. And Morgan canceled trips regularly. He was 75 years old. His health was genuinely declining. He would be dead of natural causes before the year was out. Deliberately sinking a ship carrying over 2,000 people to eliminate 3 of them is an extraordinarily blunt instrument. And it was unnecessary, because the Federal Reserve Act did not need an iceberg to pass. It needed something simpler. Something already in motion years before the Titanic was launched. It needed a financial panic that scared the public badly enough to beg for the solution that a small group of men had already designed, and it needed that solution to be offered with a name that sounded like it belonged to the people, not to the men who built it. The documented story does not require murder on the North Atlantic. It requires something more methodical, more patient, and in many ways more alarming, because what the documented story describes happened in broad daylight. It is in the Congressional record. It was acknowledged by participants in their own published memoirs, and the system it produced is still operating today. The theory needs a conspiracy. The reality only needs the truth, and the truth is darker. It is 1907. The United States of America is the only major industrial economy on Earth without a central bank. This is not an accident or an oversight. It is the product of 70 years of deliberate American resistance to concentrated financial power. Andrew Jackson killed the Second Bank of the United States in 1836, and the country never looked back. For 7 decades, the U.S. operated without a central institution controlling the money supply. In that same period, the American economy grew faster than any nation in history. The absence of a central bank made the system more volatile. Panics happened, banks failed, but it also meant that no small group of private men could control the price of money itself. By 1907, American finance had consolidated around a handful of names. J.P. Morgan, the most powerful private banker in American history. His reach extended through banks, railroads, steel companies, and shipping empires worth more than the entire federal budget. When Morgan moved, markets moved with him. When Morgan needed something from Washington, Washington generally provided it, the Rockefeller interests. John D. Rockefeller's wealth was so vast that he personally held more liquid capital than the U.S. Treasury. His banking arm, National City Bank, was the largest financial institution in the country. Paul Warburg, a German-born banker from a prominent European banking dynasty who had arrived in the United States in 1902 with a specific purpose. He had studied the German Reichsbank and the Bank of England with the precision of a man who intended to build something similar. He told anyone who would listen that the American system was dangerously primitive and that only a central bank could stabilize it. What he said less loudly was what that central bank would mean for the men who controlled it. And connected to all of them, through layers of investment and influence, the European banking interests that had spent a century establishing central banks across the continent, that had financed governments and wars and revolutions. Dazulirmken that had watched the American market grow into the largest economy on Earth while remaining the one prize they had not yet secured. These men had enormous power in 1907, but they did not have one specific power that everything else ultimately depends on. The ability to create money, not to lend money they already possessed, to create it, to expand the money supply at will, set the rate at which every bank in the country borrowed, and serve as lender of last resort to the entire financial system in a crisis, using funds they themselves brought into existence. That was the prize. Whoever held that power held something that made every other form of wealth secondary. And the American public, educated by 70 years of Jacksonian tradition, would never voluntarily hand that power to a group of private bankers, unless they were frightened enough to demand it themselves. October 1907. A failed attempt to corner the stock of the United Copper Company triggers a cascade. Depositors begin pulling money from banks connected to the scheme. The panic spreads. Trust companies, financial institutions that operated with significantly less regulation than chartered banks, begin failing. The Knickerbocker Trust Company, the third largest trust in New York, collapses under a bank run. Lines of depositors stretch around city blocks. The stock market drops nearly 50% from its high the previous year. The credit markets freeze. The entire American financial system teeters on the edge of collapse, and one man steps in to save it. J.P. Morgan, now 70 years old, summons the most powerful bankers in New York to his private library on Madison Avenue. Behind locked oak doors, surrounded by Renaissance paintings and shelves of rare manuscripts, over the course of several long nights, he personally orchestrates the rescue. He pledges his own money. He demands that other bankers pledge theirs. He decides, personally, unilaterally, which institutions will be saved and which will be allowed to fail. At one point, he physically prevents the bankers from leaving the room until they have signed the commitments he requires. He saves the system. And in saving it, he makes the argument for a central bank better than any speech ever could. If the survival of the American financial system depends on whether one private citizen is awake and willing on a given night, then obviously something more permanent is needed. If a 70-year-old man can hold the entire economy hostage to his personal decisions, then obviously an institution must exist to perform this function. Morgan proved the need himself. By being indispensable, he made his own replacement inevitable. What the public did not ask at the time, and what historians have debated since, is whether the panic was allowed to deepen longer than necessary before Morgan intervened. Congressman Charles Lindbergh Sr., a sitting member of Congress and father of the famous aviator, stated on the floor of the House of Representatives that the panic was, in his words, the work of a few financiers who wished to control the financial legislation of the United States. He was not a fringe voice. He was an elected representative making a formal statement in the Congressional record. What the record does show is this. Morgan and his network had the resources to intervene earlier than they did. They chose not to. And the institutions they allowed to fail during the panic were institutions that competed with their own. The institutions they saved were aligned with their interests. When the crisis resolved, the Morgan banking network was measurably stronger than it had been before the panic began. Whether they caused it, allowed it to worsen, or simply exploited the moment efficiently is a question the historical record does not definitively answer. What the record does answer is the outcome. The panic of 1907 created overwhelming public demand for a permanent solution, for a mechanism that would ensure this never happened again, for a central bank. The trap had been sprung. Now came the design. November 1910, 3 years after the panic. A private railroad car departs from Hoboken, New Jersey. The men who board it have been given unusual instructions. Come alone. Carry no identifying luggage. Use first names only on the journey. Do not acknowledge each other at the station if you happen to arrive at the same time. Some of them use false names entirely. They are going to Jekyll Island, a barrier island off the coast of Georgia, accessible only by private boat, owned by the Jekyll Island Club, whose membership roster included J.P. Morgan, William Rockefeller, and most of the same names that appear everywhere else in this story. No reporters, no public record, no acknowledgement that the meeting would take place. The secrecy was so complete that participants would not publicly confirm the gathering had occurred for over 20 years. Here is who was on that train. Senator Nelson Aldrich, chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, the most powerful voice in the United States Senate on matters of banking and currency. He was also the father-in-law of John D. Rockefeller Jr. He would be the public face of whatever this group produced, the legislative vehicle that would deliver it to Congress. A. Piatt Andrew, Assistant Secretary of the Treasury. His presence gave the operation the appearance of government participation and federal legitimacy. Henry P. Davison, senior partner at J.P. Morgan and Company, Morgan's personal representative. Whatever was designed on that island would reflect Morgan's interests. Benjamin Strong, head of Bankers Trust, a Morgan-controlled institution. He would later become the first president of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, the most powerful single position in the system they were about to draft. Frank Vanderlip, president of National City Bank, the largest bank in America. He represented Rockefeller's banking interests. 25 years later, he would write about the meeting in the Saturday Evening Post, confirming every detail, including the false names and the deliberate secrecy. Paul Warburg, partner at Kuhn, Loeb and Company, the intellectual architect of what they were building. He had spent years studying the European central banking model and arrived at Jekyll Island knowing exactly what he wanted to construct. 6 men, representing an estimated 1/4 of the total wealth of the entire world, meeting in secret, under false names, on a private island, to design the financial system of the United States of America. Over 9 days, they drafted the framework for what would become the Federal Reserve System. The structure they chose was deliberate in every detail. 12 regional banks spread across the country gave the appearance of geographic distribution and democratic decentralization, but the Federal Reserve Bank of New York would be the dominant institution, and New York was where the power was. The system could create money through open market operations and fractional reserve lending. That was the core. That was the prize that everything else was built around. A board of governors appointed by the president gave the appearance of public accountability and government oversight, but the presidents of the regional Federal Reserve banks would be selected by the member banks themselves. The banks being regulated would choose the people regulating them. The system was designed by bankers, for bankers, wearing the clothes of a public institution. They had one remaining problem. The American public despised centralized banking with a ferocity that was practically a national religion. Any bill that smelled like a private banking cartel's central bank would die in committee. The solution was the name. They did not call it a central bank. They called it the Federal Reserve System. Federal implied government ownership and public control. Reserve implied safety and conservative management. System implied a network rather than a single concentrated power. Every word was selected to disguise what the thing actually was. Warburg even advised that Morgan and Rockefeller appear to oppose the bill, or at minimum that their opposition be implied, so that the public would assume any measure the big bankers seemed to dislike must be in the public's interest. If the enemy of the common man appeared to fight it, it must be good. Congressman Lindbergh saw through it. He stated on the floor of Congress, and the words are in the Congressional record, "This act establishes the most gigantic trust on earth. When the president signs this act, the invisible government by the money power, proven to exist by the money trust investigation, will be legalized." He was a sitting congressman. He was not alone in his analysis. He was simply one of the few willing to say it plainly. The Federal Reserve Act was signed into law on December 23, 1913, 2 days before Christmas. Most members of Congress had already left Washington for the holiday recess. A version of the bill was brought to the floor with minimal opposition present. Woodrow Wilson signed it into law before the new year. A quote is widely attributed to Wilson in the years that followed. "I am a most unhappy man. I have unwittingly ruined my country. A great industrial nation is controlled by its system of credit." The exact sourcing of that statement is disputed by some historians. Its direct attribution to Wilson is not fully verified by primary documents. What is established is the sentiment. Wilson's later writings reflect a man who understood that what he had approved was not what it had been presented to him as. What happened in the years after the Federal Reserve's creation is not disputed. It is arithmetic. Within 7 years, the Federal Reserve expanded the money supply dramatically to finance American involvement in World War I, then contracted it sharply in 1920 and 1921, triggering a severe recession. The pattern: expand credit, fuel growth, contract credit, acquire distressed assets, would repeat. The 1920s saw easy money, low interest rates, and speculative expansion of a kind that only functions until it doesn't. In 1929, the contraction came, the Great Depression, the worst economic catastrophe in American history, arriving 16 years after the institution designed to prevent such catastrophes was created. Congressman Louis McFadden was chairman of the House Banking Committee. In 1932, on the floor of Congress, he stated, "It was not accidental. It was a carefully contrived occurrence. The international bankers sought to bring about a condition of despair here so that they might emerge as rulers of us all." Those words are in the Congressional record. McFadden was not a pamphleteer or a fringe figure. He was the chairman of the Banking Committee. Whether his conclusion is correct is a judgment the historical record leaves to each person who encounters it. That he said it in that capacity, in that form, is not in question. Since the Federal Reserve was created in 1913, the United States dollar has lost approximately 96 to 97% of its purchasing power. That figure comes from the Consumer Price Index. It is not a contested claim. It is basic arithmetic. The national debt has grown from roughly $3 billion in 1913 to over $36 trillion today. The Federal Reserve's balance sheet expanded from essentially nothing to nearly $9 trillion at its peak in 2022. Every major financial crisis since the Fed's creation, 1920, 1929, 1987, 2000, 2008, 2020, has been followed by Federal Reserve intervention that expanded both its power and the money supply, every time, without exception. And the banking interests represented on Jekyll Island in November 1910 have consolidated across the intervening century into the institutions that dominate global finance today. The Morgan banking network became J.P. Morgan Chase. National City Bank became Citigroup. The lineage is direct. It is documented corporate history. The men who sat in that railroad car under false names are the institutional ancestors of the most powerful financial entities on earth right now. The system they designed that week is still the system, almost exactly as Warburg drafted it. The regional bank presidents are still selected by member banks. The Federal Reserve has never been subject to a full independent audit. The details of its emergency lending, its relationships with member institutions, the full scope of its decisions during financial crises, none of this has ever been fully disclosed to the public whose currency it controls. So let's go back to the Titanic. Did J.P. Morgan arrange the sinking to eliminate 3 men who opposed the Federal Reserve? The evidence for that specific claim is thin. The documented opposition of Astor, Guggenheim, and Straus to central banking specifically is minimal. Morgan was an old man in declining health who canceled engagements frequently. Deliberately sinking a ship carrying 2,200 people to remove 3 of them is an extraordinarily inefficient method of achieving a political outcome that was already within reach through entirely legitimate means. The Federal Reserve Act passed with broad congressional support. 3 fewer wealthy opponents would not have materially changed that result. But here is what the documented record actually shows. J.P. Morgan's company built and operated the RMS Titanic. The ship carried lifeboats sufficient for approximately 1,178 people. There were 2,224 aboard. White Star Line, Morgan's company, was not required by regulation to carry more. They chose not to exceed those minimum requirements voluntarily. 1,502 people died in the water. Morgan was not among them. The men who designed the Federal Reserve did so in secret, on a private island, under assumed names, for the specific reason that they knew the American public would not accept what they were building if the public knew who was building it. That is not a characterization or an inference. That is what Frank Vanderlip wrote in his own published account, in his own name, 25 years after the fact. The participants confirmed it themselves. The system they designed gave their institutions control over the American money supply. The men who built the system became its first administrators. The crisis that created public demand for the system was resolved by the same man who most needed that system to exist, in a way that proved the argument for creating it while simultaneously strengthening his own network. Whether he engineered that crisis, deepened it deliberately, or simply arrived when the moment required him, is a question the record does not answer with certainty. No iceberg was necessary. The documented mechanism was simpler and more durable. Create a panic. Demonstrate your own indispensability in resolving it. Design a permanent institution in secret that formalizes that indispensability. Give the institution a name that implies it belongs to the people. And then operate it for over a century while the currency loses 97 cents of every dollar's purchasing power, and the national debt climbs from $3 billion to $36 trillion. The theory asks you to believe in a murder plot so elaborate that a single mistake would have exposed everything. The documented history asks you to believe nothing the participants themselves didn't eventually confirm. No iceberg necessary, no bodies required. Just a panic, a private island, 6 men with false names, and a Congress that voted 2 days before Christmas while most of its members were already on the way home. The Federal Reserve has never been fully audited. The system designed in 1910, accountable to no elected body, answerable to no public mandate, controls the value of every dollar you hold today, every dollar you earn, every dollar you save, every dollar you owe. That is not a theory, that is a fact. And whether there was an iceberg involved or not changes nothing about where the money went. If this video showed you a documented history you hadn't seen assembled this way before, subscribe, because the financial patterns we cover on this channel, the ones that have destroyed every empire in history, that have debased every currency ever printed, that have preceded every collapse we've examined, all run through the same system. The system drafted on Jekyll Island in November 1910. In the next video in this series, we'll show you exactly what that system has done to every economy it has ever touched. The answers aren't hiding in the future. They're written in the past, and they're documented.